And we do that so that we can share this video with you again. We'll send you a short evaluation after it's complete, as well as a link to the video. And you are welcome to share this video with your friends, coworkers, anybody else who you think might be interested in the content that we're sharing today. And then finally, we do ask that you remain muted for the time being. If you have a question that you need to ask, feel free to drop it in the chat. If you have a question that you don't want to forget, feel free to drop it in the chat. We are going to have a Q&A at the end. So at that point, you can also raise your hand and unmute and ask those questions directly, or again, use that chat function. I think that is all I have in terms of housekeeping. We're going to keep it to under an hour today. And in order to do that, so we can share all the wonderful information with you all, I am pleased to present Andrew Hall of the Ohio History Connection. Andrew, I am going to let you take it away from here, and I am going to mute.
All right. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Megan, for having me here today. And I'm excited to be able to talk with you folks about all things accessibility in outdoor events. But before we do that, just a brief introduction. So as Megan mentioned, my name is Andrew Hall. I am a 30-year-old, for a little bit longer now, at least, white man with short brown hair, a closely groomed brown beard. I'm wearing a blue paisley shirt and have floral glasses on. And I'm sitting against a blue background. So I am the senior experience developer with the Ohio History Connection. So if you've ever been to the Ohio Village, which is the historic site in downtown Columbus, that is the site that I run. I have a team of interpreters that I manage. And at that organization, I also sit on the organizational accessibility committee as the current chair. So I have been working professionally with accessibility in terms of experience programming for about 6 years now. But I've always had a mind for accessibility throughout most of my life. My brother, as well as several of my relatives, have varying degrees of different disabilities. So I've always had that as kind of a backdrop to ways that I've experienced just all things throughout my life. I have a history degree from Bowling Green State University and a master's degree in early American history from Miami University. So that's where I come from. And I joined Art Possible's board of directors, I want to say about 1.5 years ago. And it's been a wonderful time. I'm really delighted to be part of this organization to help share interesting and useful information like what we're doing today, and also just to help promote accessibility in the arts. So I'm going to go ahead and get my presentation pulled up. All right. So today we're going to be talking about, as I mentioned, planning accessible outdoor events. So the main purpose here is to make sure that we ensure access to all visitors. And that can come in a number of ways. And at first glance, it can also look very intimidating. So one of my main hopes coming out of this program is that those of you out there who do run outdoor events or who are thinking about planning an outdoor event will at least come out with a bit better of an idea of what can be done to help people attend your event and enjoy it, as well as to see that accessibility doesn't always have to be this kind of looming responsibility, and that we can find small ways to make our events more accessible. All right. So for starters, we've got the basics. So the concept of accessibility in and of itself is a bit nebulous, right? So everybody has their own idea of what accessibility means. what it requires, and all of that type of stuff. So I want to start this conversation by asking folks who feel comfortable sharing in the chat, what does accessibility mean to you? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when I talk about accessibility? I'll give folks a minute or so to throw their responses in, and then I can share a few before we move on. So if anybody feels like sharing, you can see that in the chat. And we're asking, what does accessibility mean to you? We'll take just another maybe 20 seconds to let anybody else who wants to add a comment go. All right, so it looks like we got a number of good responses. So I'll go ahead and pick some of them out to talk about. So we've got accessibility means that there are no major physical restraints to do an activity, which is definitely part of the whole that we're going to be looking into today. So making spaces and experiences available to everyone, making space available to folks with disabilities. Let's see. So for this individual, an accessible space would have places to sit down frequently if needed, as well as water available for free, creation of products and services that can be used by everyone and anyone to the largest extent possible. So what I'm seeing here is fantastic, because we're seeing a broad range of everything that falls within this concept of accessibility, right? So accessibility writ large is realistically the ability for everyone to access your goods and services. And that takes on the shape of a variety of things, right? So it means breaking down physical barriers, providing accommodations for people that are in need of them, designing products from the ground up that are accessible, all things like that. So I'm glad to see that we're all already on the same page and going in the same direction. So I like to break this concept down specifically between two major topics. So we have what I call big A accessibility versus little a accessibility. So the former, that kind of big A accessibility, is what I think of when I talk about things like ADA compliance. So compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or doing building projects, installing lifts or ramps, things like that, things that require a great deal of investment. And I think that's what a lot of people think of right off the bat when they think of accessibility. But that little a accessibility is more of what we are going to be talking about today. So that concept of little changes, little things that can be done to make a space more accessible. So, we'll get more into this in depth here in a little bit, but it's things like making sure you have adequate seating, considering what kind of shade you have as an offer for people, considering the distances that people might have to walk or just generally traverse at an event. That big A accessibility really involves a lot of external forces. So things that we don't have a lot of control over. But that little a accessibility, as I said, that's what we want to focus on today, because we do have a lot of control over what kinds of amenities or experiences we offer. And those are often the things that, while they aren't big and flashy, they have some of the deepest impact. So I want to make sure that we really dig into that as we go throughout this presentation. And I think we really hit on this last question here with some of your responses. So the concept of, why do we make spaces accessible? So what is even the point? And beyond just ensuring that people with disabilities have the capability of attending your event, contributing to your organization or your goals, it's everybody who benefits from accessibility, right? So as somebody mentioned earlier, there's the idea of making sure there's seating at frequent opportunities to sit down and rest. And while that certainly helps someone who may have mobility issues, that is definitely a benefit to anybody who might have to take a break or sit down and rest, or for any other reason. So something to keep in mind is that that is what we're aiming for with accessibility. So while we are hoping to help members of different disabled communities, we're also looking to help everybody else. And the image on the right is the one of the newer universal signs for accessibility. Specifically, it's not intended to be a handicap sticker. And the difference being, we have a white figure in a wheelchair that is intended to be shown in motion on a blue background, rather than being a figure that is stationary. So it's intended to show that people with disabilities are in motion, just like the rest of us are. All right. So I couldn't do one of these presentations without sharing just a few amusing anecdotes. I feel like enough of us are on the internet often enough that we have seen what are often dubbed as these kind of accessibility fails. So things that people tried to do, but just didn't do right. And in order from left to right, what we have on the screen is an electric lift that unfortunately needs to a step to access the lift, making it not overly useful, especially for someone in a wheelchair or who has issues taking steps. In the center, we have a brick building with 2 sets of stairs and an accessibility sign pointing towards the shallower set of stairs. And then, of course, on the end, we have a wooden stairway and a wooden ramp, with the wooden ramp labeled with an accessibility sticker, but the slope of the ramp is so extreme that I doubt any of us could even walk that, let alone take a wheelchair or a stroller or a walker up that ramp. And of course, I recognize that these are all the extreme, right? These are not what we normally think of when we think of ways that we're trying to be accessible, but it's an interesting reminder to everybody that when you're going to make an effort, do it in good faith. There are times where organizations and people have made things quote unquote accessible just by putting an accessible, entrance sticker on it or something like that. But if you really want to make a good faith effort, it takes a little bit of time, it takes a little bit of research, and oftentimes takes talking with members of your community to see what it is that they need. All right. So before we start talking about specific examples of things that we can do to make our events more accessible, I want to talk a little bit about the realities of accessibility. So essentially, this will be the blank canvas that you're working in and that you have to work around oftentimes. So for starters, it's always good to keep in mind that there are only so many things we can do, right? So we work within a pre-existing infrastructure, whether that be poorly paved roads or cracked sidewalks if you're doing an event in a city, old buildings if you are, let's say, part of a historic site and you're trying to do an event that also involves a structure that may or may not have been built with accessibility in mind. And then it can even include nature. If you're trying to do an event in a park or any other kind of outside setting, you're going to have to contend with the struggles of rough terrain, weather, and all sorts of other things like that. So when planning an outdoor event and wanting to make it accessible, keep these things in mind from the start. So you can think about what kinds of obstacles might be caused by the existing infrastructure. And then you can start to think about what you can do to mitigate those obstacles. So a lot of this occurs just based off of a little bit of conscious effort. And the more you start giving that conscious effort about accessibility and about what your environment has to offer, the more often you're going to just automatically start thinking about that when you're planning an event. So I can speak from experience working at the Ohio Village that over the years, we've gone from making big concerted efforts to include accessibility as parts of our events to now doing it automatically, and to start seeing similar issues to ones we've run across before while we're in the planning phases, because we've worked it into our event planning process from the ground up. And that's really what you want to aim towards, right? It's a lot easier to prepare for making your event accessible than to try last minute once you see the problem in action to correct it. So another thing that is a big reality of accessibility is this concept that people with disabilities are not out to get you. This is a unique challenge, and I know that especially not-for-profit organizations deal with this all the time. I can think of an instance when I first started with the Ohio History Connection of hearing about one particular disabled couple that had come back several times and basically called out every accessibility issue that we had that they could see. And they wrote a very strongly worded letter directly to our CEO to draw our attention to it. But many people saw that as essentially an attempt to show us that nothing we can do will ever do enough. And it's easy to get discouraged in those types of situations. But to be honest, that is by far not the norm, right? More often than not, I'd say probably 99% of the time, the patrons who want to come to your events or who want to participate in your activities, they're not going to call you out for attempts at making things more accessible. If anything, you'll often hear praise or compliments about attempts at making things accessible, and might even get some additional feedback on how you can continue to improve in the future. At an event that we actually just held last weekend called Storybook Village, we heard from a family that had a young girl in a motorized wheelchair that this had been the third year that they had come to Ohio Village for special events, and that this year was the most accessible year they'd seen in terms of how many spaces they were able to access, how many characters they were able to meet, and how many activities they were able to participate in. They also left a comment card with us with recommendations on how we can continue to do what we were already doing. So that's the type of behavior we really want to encourage, because the people who use those accessible features are the ones who are going to help us continue to grow. And the last thing I want to comment about the realities of accessibility is something that I've already at least mentioned, which is that oftentimes small changes can make the biggest differences. And you'll see that when I get to some of these examples that I'm going to share. And for those who are unable to see the image that I have on the right side of the screen, it connects back to that comment I was making about nature, where it's essentially a hiking trail that has an inaccessibility or an inaccessible sign posted at the front. All right. So getting started with outdoor spaces, I'm just going to highlight a couple of questions that you should ask yourself over time. And then we'll jump into some specific examples of how these different things have applied in at least the work that I have done. And after that, we'll get into some Q&A, and we can talk about any issues you might be facing or any questions you might have or things you'd like to share as well. So you should always start off this process by taking a moment to recognize the things that you, your team, or your organization have already done in favor of accessibility, or things that might already be in your favor in the outdoor space that you're planning on using. So highlight those things to your visitors to show them what you have, what is easily accessible, and use that as a starting point to continue to grow and build your accessible platform. And again, keep in mind that accessibility makes things easier for everyone. And a really great analog that my wife has actually shared with me, and I have seen on countless occasions, and I'm sure many of you have too, is if you need to think of a non-disabled analog to accessibility, a great option to think of is parents with strollers. So if you could think of a parent with a stroller struggling anywhere during your event, then a person with a mobility issue would also likely struggle with that type of experience. So if maybe you don't have a lot of experience working with people with disabilities, I have a feeling you've likely seen more parents with strollers. So it's just an easy way to kind of draw a comparative line. So a few questions just to kind of get your brains thinking about the concept. So what is the availability of seating at your event or at your venue? So is your event a seated event? So, or is it a concert or presentation? If it is, what kind of seating do you have available? Is there a space for a person who might be in a wheelchair, or do you have a space set off to the side for people who would prefer not to sit in a densely packed crowd? Do you have seating anywhere between where people might park or arrive and where your event is going to be happening? Something else to consider is what kind of weather might you expect? And I know this one feels obvious, that if we're doing an outdoor event, we need to be aware of the weather. But think about it in terms of, is it going to be hot? If it is, what kind of shade trees are there available on your site or in the area that you're using? And is there seating that can be available under those shade trees? Is there cover if it would rain? Enough cover that people have easy access to said cover. This just adds in another layer to all of the prep work that goes into building an event. Do you have accessible restrooms? This is especially important if you're renting a site. So let's say you're hosting an event at a local park. Are there accessible restrooms at the park? And if there's not, can you bring restrooms in? And if you don't have a budget for that, can you at least advertise that you don't have accessible restrooms? Because you don't want people arriving with a need and then being disappointed that they can't fulfill that need. So something to consider. If you're using signs, does your signage use high contrast colors and a legible sans serif font? I have an amusing anecdote to share about this later on, but clear, legible signage is a very important thing. And again, it can be useful in a lot of situations. Are there any difficult slopes that you need to warn people about? This is particularly pertinent if, again, if you're doing something at a park or maybe at a historic site or anywhere that might have a natural walking path. Think about how easily it might be, how easy it might be for people who are older, people who have mobility issues, people who are in wheelchairs, people with strollers. What kind of difficulty might those slopes present people with? And then the last question, at least that I'm going to pose here for you all to think about, is what kind of distances do you expect your guests to traverse? So starting from where they arrive and then thinking about where they need to get to for your program, and then back, how far are they going to have to move? Is it a short walk? Is it a mile? I can speak from personal experience with the Ohio History Center. From our front door, when you walk into our lobby, if you plan to walk all the way to the village, walk all the way around the village, and then leave, it's well over a mile. And it's probably close to half a mile just from the History Center down to the village. So think about like who has the stamina to be able to do that, and what can you do for people who don't? So just things that are good to keep in mind. Oh, apologies for that. I have a puppy sitting here and she's a little overexcited today. So I'm going to start sharing some examples of things that I have encountered in my work over the years, and I'll explain some of the process that we encountered in developing our kind of small A accessibility fixes to them, and then we'll go from there. So I want to start with this idea of seating, which we've talked about a couple of times today already. So seating can be very important in a number of different instances. And the first one that came to mind for me is from an event that we host every year in October called All Hallows Eve. So All Hallows Eve is an evening event out in Ohio Village. And one of the hallmarks of that program is a storytelling activity that happens at a bridge that runs across our site. So it's a retelling of the legend of Sleepy Hollow, where, as you can see in the bottom left image, which is an outdoor photograph just after dusk with a crowd of people sitting on the ground in front of a bonfire. We have a storyteller who sits behind the bonfire and uses a PA system to tell the story to the crowd. And all throughout the story, on a path that runs across the bridge and then around the area where you see the people seated, we have horses and riders who dramatically recreate the story. So when I first started, actually my second day on the job was helping to run this event, which was definitely a trial by fire type of experience. But that first year, I noticed very clearly that, and you might not be able to see it so well from this perspective, but there is a significant angle of decline down this hill to get to where this little natural amphitheater is. And I noticed people with strollers who were really struggling to get their kids down to listen to the story. There were older folks with canes who were struggling to maintain their balance as they were trying to get to a good spot. And even plenty of people who had to stay standing because they didn't have the ability to sit down like everybody else. So in the years to follow, we've actually added a solid line of benches, which unfortunately you can't see in this photograph. Unfortunately, our professional photographers aren't in the habit of taking a picture of our accessible benches. But those benches run all the way around the external perimeter of this natural amphitheater, and are reserved for people that need accessible seating. And we don't discriminate in terms of this accessible seating. We take it on faith that the people who need them are going to use them. We have signs indicating that that's what they're for. Of course, we're not going to kick anybody out unless we see somebody who's in desperate need of a seat. Um, but those benches run all the way around. They still are within excellent earshot of the storyteller and actually provide those folks with one of the best views in the house because they're right along the edge of the path where the horses run. And that ends up giving them essentially a front row view of the Headless Horseman and Ichabod Crane as they go racing by. It brings up an interesting side comment here of when attempting to plan accessible seating, especially at an outdoor event, it can be easy to just work it in wherever you can find it. And of course, if that's all you can do, then of course that anything's better than nothing. But oftentimes accessible seating is in not necessarily the best spots, whether in terms of visual ability or auditory ability. Accessible seating sometimes feels shoehorned in. So if you can make it feel like it's a natural portion of your program, then I encourage you to try for that. The second example that I wanted to share is referencing to the image on the bottom right, which is a natural green area with a gravel path that runs in between it, that wraps around to the left and then to the right, heading up from Ohio Village to the Ohio History Center. So as I mentioned before, it's a long way. It's quite a long walk. There are actually two different paths that can head from the center to the village, and both are just about as long. One path has a lot more tree cover than the other, but the path that we're looking at right now is the path that most people use when coming from one site to the other. And while you can't see the accessibility fix in this photo, I wanted you to be able to just get a sense of the distance that people would walk. And of course, you can see the people here to scale. On a normal basis, we have benches placed at fairly regular intervals, starting from where the village ends and then running up the path up to the bridge, knowing that it can be a long walk, knowing that even walking on gravel, we do our best to make sure it's raked out smoothly, but it can still provide somewhat unsteady walking spaces. So we try to provide seating so people can take a break. The reason you're not seeing that in the image right now is because one of the various things that happen on our site is a vintage baseball game. So we take the benches away during that time and move them more into the shade so people can watch the game, and so that the baseball players aren't tripping over the benches while they're running to catch a fly ball. Another great example is working with outside partners. So this is great because it takes a little bit of pressure off of you and your organization, because once you've come up with an idea or come up with a potential fix for an accessibility need, you can often rely on your local community to help you find workarounds or solutions. And especially when you're working with accessibility, working with different disabled communities is a great way to find out what those people need and what they would want from your organization. So I have just a couple of quick examples that I'll share here, and I can obviously talk more about them later if anybody has questions. But we, over the past couple of years, have developed an audio descriptive tour of our historic site, Ohio Village. And it was actually born out of a visit by one of our regular members who had a blind sister who had always wanted to come and visit the village, but never felt like there was anything for her to experience there, since so much of it is visual. So we found a couple of days where she could come and visit with us and walk through with us as we tried out an audio descriptive tour. And we've been able to grow that into a legitimate program that we can offer to blind guests or blind tour groups who might want to come through. The next one is we've developed over time a relationship with the Autism Society of Central Ohio because we realized a need for visitors who either had developmental disorders or just generally needed a safe space to get away from the hubbub of a large event. I'm sure we've all seen it where there's a kid who's essentially having a meltdown at an event, whether it be because something happened or because they're overstimulated. And it's nice to have somewhere for those individuals to step aside and relax and kind of have a reset. So about 5 years ago, we started working with the Autism Society of Central Ohio, and at typically 3 or 4 of our large events every year, they provide us with a sensory safe space at our events where they come in, they provide their own volunteers, and we give them a space to run a sensory safe space. And they typically don't turn anybody away unless their room is over full. So even if you're not a visitor with autism or another developmental disorder, they will welcome you in if you need time to relax. And even beyond that safe space, the Autism Society has been a great resource and a great partner for us to just find ways to make our general programming more accessible to the people who are members of their organization. The last example that I share on this page is one that references the picture you see on the right side, which is a woman with brown hair and a black shirt standing against a white and brown background and is signing. And this is one that I'm particularly proud of based on and primarily on the reciprocal nature of it. We started working about 5 years ago with the ASL program at Columbus State Community College as a means of finding reliable interpreters for our programs. So being a nonprofit and a historic site, we don't always have the budget we would like to be able to bring in ASL interpreters. So we've actually found that this partnership with Columbus State works really, really well because their students provide us with a valuable service by providing interpretation for speakers, storytelling, things like that. And the students benefit from their experience with us because due to the nature of our partnership, we've essentially tied it in with their curriculum. So they gain practical experience working with us. It features into their schooling. It's not necessarily an extracurricular, plus we get the benefit out of it as well. But the main takeaway from all 3 of these points is that there are a lot of people out there who would be more than happy to help you if you have questions, comments, issues on how to make your events accessible. And they're more often more than happy to work with you.
Andrew, this is Megan. I'm just letting you know it's about 20 till 3, just so you have a time check for you.
Thank you. I have 2 more slides and then we'll take questions. So this next bit is about using what you've got. So, let's say you have a site, but you don't have a lot of money and you just want to make some physical accessibility changes, things that can just help a wide array of people without having to put a whole lot of effort into it. One of the ways that we did that over the years is by adding little wooden thresholds onto our buildings. So the building that you're seeing in the picture here is a kind of a brick red wooden building with yellow trim and a red roof with a wooden boardwalk out front and 2 doors. Now, several years ago, these doors did not have any kind of a threshold. It was just a maybe 2-inch step up from the boardwalk to the door and then into the building, which for the vast majority of people does not present any kind of issue. But with the kind of advent of electric scooters and electric wheelchairs becoming more and more common, we started noticing that more and more visitors were having trouble getting through the door. They were getting stuck. And we recently had a visitor in one of those types of electric wheelchairs comment to us that they were grateful that we had literally any kind of threshold for a ramp, because their wheelchair weighs close to 400 pounds. So even though they have family members that come and visit with them, it's not reasonable or realistic to expect that their family members are going to help lift them over the top of that little lip and get into the room. And these thresholds, we have the benefit of that these are our buildings, so we can modify them as we see fit. But if you're renting a space like an open air pavilion at a park and you see a step like that, if you do a little bit of homework and you at least know about it in advance, you can buy a little like hard plastic ramps off of places like Amazon that are temporary ramps and thresholds that allow you to make places more accessible and that you can just pick up and take with you at the end of the event. And there are plenty of other solutions that you can think about in advance. And that's the key here, thinking in advance and getting used to thinking that way. My second point here is just a really quick one. And it seems like it's one that wouldn't, we kind of had like an oh duh moment when we thought of it, but it has been a benefit. In the path between where our village is and where our main museum is, there is an area with picnic tables that we do see a lot of families enjoying. However, you had to walk into mulch to get to those picnic tables off of an asphalt path. So again, a person with mobility issues or in a wheelchair would have a harder time accessing those tables and eating with their families. So we literally just moved several of the tables closer to the path, so that way a person in a wheelchair, again, as an example, could roll their wheelchair straight up to the end of the picnic table, and they no longer even have to bother with the mulch. And it was as simple as just moving the table a few feet over towards the path. All right. And then my last slide here, I want to take only just a couple minutes and then give folks time for questions, is signs and bathrooms. So as I mentioned before, signage is extremely important. And it's important in a number of ways. And to start off, like I said before, you want to make sure your signs are written in clear sans serif fonts, so you don't want to have any issues for people who have visual impairments to actually read the sign. And you want to make them high contrast in terms of colors to make them easy to read in any lighting. The reason that I bring this up in particular is that, again, with Ohio Village, we are a late Victorian era site, and we often find ourselves wanting to make our signage in keeping with the overall tone of our time period, which does mean using, fancy cursive script and things like that to create our signs. But we learned very quickly that while it may be in keeping with our overall aesthetic, it certainly doesn't make it easier for visitors to actually see what's going on, because not everybody has the eyes trained to read that type of script the way we do. So beyond just that, signage can be used for a variety of things. I don't have any examples of it here because I couldn't find any in our photo database, but when we bring in accessible restrooms, because we recognize that our restrooms are not as accessible as they could be, we make sure that we have little lawn signs, kind of like the Storytime sign in the top right, which is an orange sign with white letters that say Storytime location. We have signs like that have arrows on them that will point to accessible restrooms and things like food trucks and other amenities that we recognize may be printed in a handout that visitors get when they first arrive. But when you start adding, accessibility concessions, food, programming, and all sorts of other things that are happening, that you only have so much space on a handout. So it's good to have visual reminders for those types of amenities scattered all throughout your event. It's just to make it easier for people to know what things are available and where those things are. All right, so I know I went through a whole lot of content in just about 45 minutes. And of course, I know I could not touch on everything in terms of outdoor events, but I hope that I was able to give at least a broad approach and get you thinking about some questions. So I would be more than happy to entertain any questions folks might have, or if anybody has any accessibility stories that you would like to share, I think we'd be happy to hear those as well.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was like, I was taking copious notes, and I don't even plan a whole lot of outdoor events. But I was even thinking about things in my own home. I have a lot of family members who are older, and when we do outdoor get-togethers, it's good to think about the same kind of things you would think about for that type of event, like making sure that walkways are clear and that there aren't too many barriers for people to step over or move around, seating, water, all that good stuff.
It's certainly the type of thing that once you start doing it on a somewhat regular basis, it just seeps into your everyday life, and you start realizing that you're doing it everywhere you go.
I also did appreciate too, like a lot of times people are told to make their events or their spaces more accessible, but they don't fully understand the why of that. And so to understand that, you know, some wheelchairs are extraordinarily heavy and they require the additional support, or understanding that just because someone is blind doesn't mean they're not going to enjoy visual medium. There are ways for them to also enjoy that, is really important context.
Absolutely. And something that we've tried to change our thinking about over the years is that everybody has, just like what we saw earlier in our presentation, everybody has a different meaning when they think about accessibility. So when somebody approaches us and says this needs to be accessible, it warrants a conversation on what do they mean by accessibility, what do they see that's missing that we can provide, and what can we realistically do, because again, there is that intimidating like first step into the realm of accessibility that if you don't have a lot of experience with it, it does all seem like that big A accessibility, the getting building permits and finding funders to get things changed, when realistically it can start with these small things that do make a big difference.
So I will say, if you do have a question and you don't want to have to put it in the chat box, feel free to unmute and you can just go ahead and ask. Megan, we're noting that the turnout for this webinar is excellent, and we're very thankful that all of you joined us today.
Andrew, this is Megan. I would love to know, like, what you do in terms of audio for outdoor events. I know sometimes people who use hearing aids struggle when there are multiple sounds happening, or people who might have a hearing disability are going to need something amplified. What are some solutions you've come up with that?
Oh, that's a great question. So that's actually one that we're still working on. We, over the years, I'd say over the past maybe three and a half years, have been collecting different types of projection equipment. So we have a portable speaker, and that's primarily what we use when we have a speaker. So, let's say we have a tent where we're doing a presentation. We'll always have that portable amplifier with a microphone attached. The hope is that that sound will at least reach the back of the crowd in a way that's strong enough for everybody to hear. We also have these other microphones that they kind of look like something a sports commentator might wear, where it has a little speaker box that clips to the back of your pants. And that's meant to be worn like when you're running tours. That even has the ability, we've not tried it out, where you have special headphones that can actually tune into that speaker, so it goes directly into your headphones. But yeah, so we just do a lot of experimentation and kind of play around with what works in the different areas, but we always try to test things in advance. So that way we're not waiting until the day of an event to find out whether a solution is going to work or not.
Thank you. That's great.
So I see that there's a question in the chat box. So what sort of things should be noted on event descriptions and registration pages? What should people with disabilities know before registering for an event? Julia, that's a great question. And that's actually something that I know my colleagues and I are still, like, every time we have a new registration page or an event page, we're always growing and expanding what we're putting on there. So just for starters, you'll want to think about what is happening at your event. So where is it? Things that you'll want to list are overall distances that people will have to traverse. Are there any areas that are inaccessible? Because you really want to be upfront about that. So as an example, as I mentioned before, especially with historic sites, if you are working with a historic building, you might have a building that just, maybe people can enter the first floor, but they just can't access the second floor. And it's better to be upfront and say that, the first floor is accessible, the second floor is not at this time, because you want to give people that expectation so they're not disappointed when they arrive. You can always talk about things like accessible restrooms, accessible parking. We often put a note at the bottom of our events that say, essentially, if you require any special accommodations, please contact us in advance. So that way we can set things up before people arrive. And if you're doing a registration, so if you're actually collecting data from people, a really good thing to do is to collect, do you have any mobility issues? Do you have any audio visual impairments? Do you require, like a large, essentially like a large print handout or anything like that? As I was already saying, the nice thing about that is it's an ever growing experience, right? Nobody will ever get it right on the 100% right on the very first attempt. There's always going to be somebody who shows up and throws you for a loop. But you can learn and grow from that, and just do your best and keep trying, because that's really what people with disabilities are looking for. They want to see people that are trying to make their spaces accessible. And oftentimes you can grow a program or event by offering those accessibility options, because I can say specifically for the blind and deaf communities, as well as for the autism community, at least in Columbus, it's very word of mouth. Like when somebody has a great experience somewhere or a terrible experience somewhere, they will share that with their friends and family and throughout their network. So the more of that you can provide, the better exposure you're going to get. And I see Renee has a question. And I'm actually really glad you mentioned this, because I didn't have the chance to say it in our presentation before. But Renee is asking about having a social story to help set expectations in advance of an event. And absolutely, social stories are a wonderful way to give people an expectation of what your event, what your site, what your space has that is accessible. If you have never had experience with a social story, I encourage you to look it up, because social stories are essentially originally developed for individuals with developmental disabilities who essentially are looking for a script that is written to show them what will your experience be, from the point of entry to your experience to your point of exit. And Megan just posted a really awesome link for social stories. I know that that's actually where I got my start when I started doing that. But a social story, it can actually be useful for anybody who wants to visit your site. So a social story can describe, this is what your entry experience is going to be like. These are the people who are going to greet you and who are going to take your information. This is where your activities are going to be. These are the types of people you might encounter. These are the, like, where you might find restrooms, things like that. And, you know, again, as with everything accessibility related, anybody could benefit from that, not just people who really need that social structure prior to the event. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions coming through at this time. However, what I'm going to do real quick for everybody in this meeting, I'm going to toss my email and my work phone number into the chat. So that way, if anybody has any questions about accessibility and, you know, working with events and things like that, that they think of after the event, or that you didn't really want to talk about live here, I'd be more than happy to talk with you personally.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Absolutely.
This was really wonderful. And like I said, I think if anyone is like me, they've gleaned a ton of information. Remember, we did record this. So if you did not take all of the notes that you had hoped to take, we will be posting it on our YouTube page and then linking to it on our website and sending the link out to people who registered and participated. So you can go back and check on some of the wonderful tips that Andrew shared. Please keep an eye on our social media. We have some other events coming up this summer. I'm going to toss it to Megan real quick to plug the one or two. I think we have 2 or 3 more that are coming up as a part of our summer programming.
Oh, Molly, we do. Do I have the dates and times in front of me?
I can help you out, hopefully.
We do have a wonderful, if you're Columbus based or live close to the area, we are showing an outdoor film next Thursday at the Vanderelli Room, which is located in Franklinton, in the Vanderelli Room lawn. It's called Mari Carmen. It's a wonderful film about a musician who is blind and how she navigates the world. You're welcome to bring your blankets, your chairs, beanbag, whatever you're comfortable with, some food. We'll have light snacks and water for you. It'll begin a little bit after 9 p.m. over there at the Vanderelli Room right when the sun goes down. So we'd love to have you join us. It may be hot. Just be prepared for that.
And we will be using Andrew's advice on how to make it very accessible
Yes.
as our outdoor event.
And then I actually think I have the other one here. In July, we're going to be offering do I have it? No, yes, a Careers in the Arts workshop titled Money Received from Artwork, which is really about the effects of Social Security, disability benefits, and healthcare. I don't have that date right in front of me, but if you follow us on social media or you check out our website, you can find the rest of that information. We have not opened it up for registration yet, so you haven't missed anything. You've not even missed the chance to register. But if you're an artist who finds that to be of interest to you, we'd love to have you join us. It will be on Zoom.
And if you're in northern/northeastern Ohio, please swing by the Maslin Museum or Artist Open Studio to check out selections from our current Accessible Expressions Ohio exhibition. If you are not in that area but still want to see the art, you can check out our Square store by visiting our website and looking at the homepage. We have a link up there. It says click here to visit our Square store, and you can check out the art that was in the show this year. And with that, I think we will wrap it up and say thank you again to Andrew, and thank you to all of you who joined us today.
Yes, thank you. Have a good
Bye,
one.
everyone.